we're just used to thinking that we have unlimited resources. And until products come with labels showing the impact of choices we're making, then it's going to be just hard to do it purely with regulation. I do think as humans, we'll make better choices if we understand the implications of our choices. I think in the food industry, they started putting calories. So at least people are making a conscious decision on what they're eating, right? Maybe we could have a tag that says, well, this was the environmental impact of you buying this pair of shoes or buying this new, computer. And I mean, I forget the statistic. I think I've said this before. I think something like 70% of the world's resources are used by 25% of the world's population.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Clean Techies, the podcast. This is episode 45, and today we are joined by Priya Vijayakumar, who is the CEO and co-founder of WattIQ. She's been in IoT for over 8 years, but originally has actually a really fascinating background where she studied chemical engineering and then ended up in aerospace. And so really fascinating generally how she ended up in IoT. WattIQ is an IoT company specifically focused on reducing climate impact through helping to find wasted energy and working with manufacturers to create better, longer-lasting products. And in this discussion, we went over a lot of things, kind of what is IoT generally, of course, what they are doing specifically at WattIQ. We talked about the benefits of integrating IoT into your operations. We talked about cybersecurity and finding, this one was one of my favorites, finding your direction in your early career days, given kind of her experiences and exposure to it. But a really great episode with Priya in general. We really hope you enjoyed the episode. Before we do get into the show, we of course want to make mention and thank our sponsors, NextWave Partners. NextWave are experts in talent acquisition, recruitment, and retention across the climate tech, renewables, technology, and ESG spaces globally. So if your team is growing and you're looking to make a career change out, you can reach out to them and talk about what your next steps are. NextWave can be reached various ways. You can reach them at their website, next-wavepartners.com, or you can reach out to one of the consultants directly via their LinkedIn page by finding the person who's most suitable to speak with in your arena. So again, thank you so much to NextWave for helping make this show possible and sponsoring. And let's get into the show. All right, welcome to the show, Priya. How are you doing today?
Thank you. It's a beautiful day in San Francisco, and happy to have this conversation with you.
Yeah, absolutely. Really, really excited to have you on. I don't think we've had a discussion about IoT in detail yet, I don't think, on the podcast. So I'm really excited to be kind of discussing what we're going into today. I guess to start off, could you maybe just kind of give us a bit of an introduction about yourself? And, feel free to go in as deep as you want, maybe the origin story of how you ended up in the space. Would really love to understand kind of that journey.
Okay, well, I think I've had a little bit of an unusual journey here. I've sort of been in the IoT space, I think almost 8 to 10 years now. So I consider myself an IoT war veteran. But my traditional learnings was really chemical engineering. I went to University of Toronto, and when I graduated, I actually went into something that I knew nothing about, which was aerospace. And so I worked with aircraft engines initially. And then moved on to, the energy business, renewable energy. So the early days of wind turbines. So I've always sort of gotten into industries that I knew nothing about and just enjoyed the challenge of it. I'd probably say when I initially got into the IoT sector, maybe about 10 years ago, we focused a lot around, asset tracking, right? Because we saw the inefficiencies that existed in classical manufacturing industries because data was in silos. And so those were some of the early things that we did in IoT. It wasn't called IoT back then. And then, like everyone, you have this moment in life where you're like, there's a disconnect between having a job that's intellectually satisfying, but not personally fulfilling. And I think I was exploring some startup ideas kind of in the health sector when I really came across this particular technology during a consulting engagement. And the original application of this technology was, how do we save energy, right? There's a lot of energy that gets wasted because people leave electrical assets plugged in. But, like a lot of startups, the initial application of the technology doesn't always translate to a great business model. And I saw the opportunity to spin out this technology and form a new company with my co-founder, Mark Madsen, that could take the same data that we had been gathering for 5 years at that point, under a different business, and apply to a whole different space, which not only had a much bigger impact for the business, but also had much bigger impact for the planet from a sustainability perspective. So you could kind of say an unintentional path into this, but probably the driver was wanting to do something that had a more positive impact on society and not just building a great business.
Interesting. So that's an interesting journey. I feel like that's a common thread that a lot of people on this show have had, where they started in something and they ended up in obviously a different area, which I think is, to me, it's just like the evolution of understanding how, I've had, I think the most interesting person I've had on in terms of that was somebody who was a lineman when he was younger, and then ended up going to a grid software type of company, or a grid IoT type of company as well. But I guess I'd be keen to understand, before we get too deep into what WattIQ is doing, could you maybe explain, given that you've gone through many, it seems like at least 3 times now, maybe 4, what is your framework for entering into a completely new industry and space when you know nothing about it? How do you go about trying to understand and learn? Again, it sounds like you like intellectual challenges naturally, but how do you go about kind of that process of learning and becoming an expert in something?
So I think the first rule of thumb is to remain curious, right? So not to be content with your existing knowledge, and at least for me, not to feel like I need to have all the answers. I don't need to be the smartest person in the room. And this sort of happened even early in my career, because I was leading a team of folks to manage maintenance on all the 747 and 76 aircraft engines. And I was incredibly new to the field, but I relied on the ability to learn from people around me and build the right team, right? Which has become really instrumental as you build a company, because you have to be able to bring the right folks together. So I would definitely say, I think having the openness to learn about something, but also appreciate the experience that people who already are in the industry bring, and to be able to connect those dots, and sometimes to look at the same problem a little bit differently, because you look at that same data set differently.
Yeah, interesting. I think obviously my day job is as a recruiter, and there's a lot of new things I learn all the time. So I think I can see some of the similarities. That's very helpful. Okay, so why don't we talk about, why don't you walk us through kind of specifically what you're doing with WattIQ, kind of the clients you serve, just kind of give us the rundown generally, and then we'll kind of take it from there and go down whichever rabbit hole seems the most interesting.
Sounds good. So it's kind of the premise around this technology and the company is that electrical assets, which are some of the most resource intensive in nature, right, from impact to the environment, most of them tend to be left plugged in all the time. And electrical signatures from those devices are like the heartbeat of that device. It tells you a lot about that piece of equipment. I think electrical engineers have known this forever, right? That there's a lot that you can learn from a unique electrical signature in a piece of equipment. What we did was harness this at scale and apply machine learning, so that now we can start giving people insights into the health of your equipment, right? How often you're using a piece of equipment, right? Which, you're sort of like, well, this is pretty common in the consumer space. My phone tells me how often I'm on it. But in a lot of industries outside of manufacturing, it's not common practice. People actually have no idea how often they use some incredibly expensive pieces of equipment that they have, right? So there was this huge problem. I think Cisco in the early days had valued asset utilization as I think almost a $2.3 trillion of economic value from an IoT use case. But it was just very hard to solve that problem, right? And there wasn't an elegant way to solve it, because you have so many different types of equipment, so many different manufacturers. How do you find a unifying solution, right, that would work across all these? So that's essentially what we do. We harness the power of electrical data, but we do it at scale to give insights into these data blind spots that have existed for years. When am I using my equipment? Is it just collecting dust? Is it even healthy? right? And of course, where is it, right? So those three key things, utilization, location, and condition, have actually become really important pieces of data to optimizing how you use a piece of equipment through its entire life cycle. Are you chucking something away before it even needs to be thrown away just because it's 5 years old? But maybe you've never really turned it on, right? So, and this becomes important because we are in a resource constrained world. In a resource constrained world that's driven by business models that rely on people to buy more, right? So there's this huge disconnect. And I think if we're going to tackle the problem of sustainability, we just can't get away from addressing the problem of overconsumption.
Mm-hmm. Could you maybe talk to us? I'd like to break it down into maybe an example of a type of client you have. Like, who are your clients? Maybe could you kind of walk us through the process of an imaginary client, what it would look like to set up with WattIQ, and then kind of go through there so people can visualize it?
Some of our larger clients tend to be research labs that are very resource intensive, right? Both from an energy perspective, but also the sheer volume of electrical assets, high value analytical equipment that they have. So typically what we're doing is we kind of try to understand the business drivers for that, right? Sometimes it is driven by sustainability. Sometimes it's driven by space constraints. They're rapidly growing. They would just like to know that they're using their space optimally, driven by what's the right service contract to have on a piece of equipment, right? Because these are not cheap pieces of equipment. They have service contracts associated with them, also driven by procurement decisions they have to make. So we usually start with understanding the business problem that the customer is focused on. One of the nice things is we've developed what we call a plug and play model, right? Which is very common in the consumer space, not so common in the enterprise world. So it's very easy for customers to experience their data in the sense that we would ship them a kit. Once we understand the type of equipment that would be relevant to their use case, they plug it in, data starts flowing to the cloud. And usually we need about a couple of weeks of data to run the initial algorithms to show them, what their utilization or the condition of the equipment starts to look like, right? So part of it is we've simplified that experience to be like a consumer experience, right? So you don't have these huge hurdles to cross before they even experience the value of the data. And then, of course, we go through cybersecurity reviews and so on with large enterprise customers, as it's typical, before we go into production. But the ability for a customer to see the value of this data is usually less than 30 days.
Okay, so that's an interesting example. So could you maybe talk about I guess I'd be keen to understand what are the values that come out of this, savings, maybe other insights that I'm not, kind of privy to or aware of?
On a few different fronts, right? I think if you take something from a understanding energy usage perspective or equipment reliability, things like freezers, right? Everyone heard about the -80 freezers to store the vaccines. Well, there's lots of these -80 freezers in research laboratories. And they tend to not, freezers are not something that people maintain really well because relative to other pieces of equipment, they're inexpensive. So they're also the most neglected. So the first level of value is to show people, is your freezer actually healthy? Is it maintaining temperature the way it should? How is it on its energy consumption? We find that as equipment ages, it's actually using 30 to 40% more energy. And people have no idea. All right, so here you are trying to run around, turn off all your lights to save energy when you're just wasting energy because you haven't taken care of energy hogs that are in the building. So that's sort of a simple example of value from a sustainability perspective. Customers can also see that sometimes, 10% of the equipment fleet is never turned on. I mean, we actually show people, especially in moderate sized research labs, you could probably take away 20% of their equipment and nobody would know. But that translates into space utilization, right? And HVAC, which is a huge energy impact once again on the planet. So, and a lot of this is really because unintentionally, right? People are no different from consumers. We've purchased things without understanding the implications to the planet, just because we can, right? So scientists or researchers have budgets. They don't want to lose the budget. So they're like, well, let's buy this equipment. And it's great for the equipment manufacturer because they get to sell more. Who cares? It's sitting on a bench collecting dust and somebody's paying a service contract on it. And like I said, it's not just in the enterprise. We as consumers do the same thing, right? And the data is now informing people on, well, it might have only cost you $50,000 to buy this piece of equipment, but you're spending $250,000 maintaining it over over the next 5 years, right? So that's the business impact, but also the environmental impact of buying something. Does that help maybe show the value?
Yeah, no, that makes sense. So obviously there's the energy savings of being able to understand like where things are being, for example, operating inefficiently, and then kind of helping them inform decisions of, hey, do we actually need this equipment around? I'm guessing in several cases there's resale value to the equipment if they want to sell it to somebody else, or maybe find a way to ensure that they're using it, right? Because I think that I'm assuming some of these places, if they're donor run, the donors would be happy to know that things are actually being used.
And you have like so there's probably different types of labs in terms of, you might have a high throughput lab, like let's pick a Quest Diagnostics as an example, right? It's high throughput. They're running machines to the ground. They want to know that the equipment is reliable. So their use case is going to be a little bit different from a research lab where work is more sporadic. How you use the equipment is a little bit more sporadic. So as a researcher, you might think you're using this a lot because you turned it on like over Christmas. But in reality, that's something that you probably could use as a shared equipment, right? So the concept of a shared service model, no different from the Uber, right? So I think increasingly the opportunity to share assets, especially resource intensive assets, I think is going to be significant for the shared economy. But that's not possible without having the data.
I'd be keen to understand, is this a model that's being pursued by any, I would guess probably more so on the consumer focused manufacturers, where a manufacturer might consider actually footing the bill for some of this equipment in order to get data and research about how to improve their equipment?
Right. And so this is the interesting thing, right? So this product as a service model. You can see how that shifted the car industry. The car industry would send out warranty information, right? Or issues with cars. They have no idea how their cars are driven, no concept. And Tesla changed that, right? They have more information than you probably want about your driving habits. And similarly, in a lot of these industries, the OEMs actually are not connected to their end product. So there is actually value for the equipment manufacturers to be more connected to the end product, right? And that was the whole promise of smart things. But in the enterprise, it's very challenging because of security issues. So let's take a typical customer, they might have over 100 equipment manufacturers in their laboratory. There's no way IT can sustain connected devices and security requirements for 100 different vendors, right? It's just not practical. I think some of the infrastructure providers have lagged in their ability to support some of the IoT devices in the enterprise. But kind of that aside, that's been a limitation in the enterprise world. Like you have the smart coffee machine, right? You've got the smart blender in the home. A lot easier in the consumer space. And that has educated the manufacturer about your buying habits, how you use the product. Well, that's very limited and it's almost non-existent in most of the enterprise world. There's this huge data gap between the manufacturer and the end user.
Yeah, I think that's interesting from a perspective of, for people who are familiar with software, the idea of sprints, right? To kind of go in and iterate on your software several times as quickly as possible. Whereas manufacturing is more of this waterfall effect, kind of like, here's the blueprint, go build it. And you look at, obviously it has become much more of a thing nowadays where people are trying to take as much data as they can and adjust their products to make them better. But I think that'll be interesting to see how IoT can play into that. I guess, one thing I'm really curious about before we get too deep into this is I want to have, is there any way you can kind of explain to us, maybe with like a metaphor or some kind of similar story, just to demonstrate how exactly are these devices able to measure you mentioned something about the electrical engineering aspects. how are they able to measure these items on the health of the appliance, for example? And again, most of the people listening are probably not electrical engineers, so maybe a non-technical explanation of that would be helpful.
So I think we talk about health at a few different levels, right? You have an electrical signature that comes in because we look at the power consumed, and provided you have the right technology, you can get to pretty high resolution on the electrical data. So there are certain common faults that we pick up by just understanding the electrical signature. And I'll take something that's very relatable, freezers, right? Before some of the newer models of what they call variable drive freezers came along, compressors have a very unique cycle. And as they age, they take longer and longer for a compressor to cycle. And so you're starting to understand those patterns, right? To say, well, how long does it take when I open the freezer door? Is it taking 10 minutes or is it taking me 2 hours for the freezer to return to the temperature set point that it should be at? I'm sure in the home freezers, people have seen lots of ice forming and they're wondering why is all the food at the back freezing over, right? That's probably, it might be because your door is not closed properly, right? We could pick that up in an electrical signature. So we have additional sensors as well beyond monitoring, electrical signature, like a temperature sensor, a dose sensor. So we're all, combining data from lots of different sources to start understanding the health of equipment. But I think there's just some very easy things that we've been able to accomplish by combining some basic data sets that were not combined before to help people understand how sometimes even their behavior is causing equipment to age too quickly or fail.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think that's interesting. I think given that there's so many inventions that have come out of understanding what's actually happening first, right? And I like always, as my boss always says, seek to understand first. Once you understand what's going on, then you can recognize the issues. And I feel like, especially within the climate tech space, there are so many things that need to be solved, but there's, first of all, not enough people, with the access to the data that could solve it. Whereas if you can make some of these things public, to whatever extent is, not a security risk, that would allow people to be like, hey, hungry people who have kind of a competency in a certain area to go look at the data and create solutions for different problems.
Exactly.
Do you see any kind of mass applications of IoT being used in this kind of way? Again, when I say mass, I'm referring to maybe, municipalities or just some way where there's taking data that can be shared with the public and that's being tracked and being shared in a way that helps to create either transparency or opportunities for the public to kind of take action on their own.
I think there is. I think the challenge is probably conflicting interest from people selling some of these things, right? Because it's going to require an uncomfortable shift in a lot of business models, right? Because a lot of business models are built on selling more stuff. And until that shift happens, and it will, because I'll pick an example in the industry that happened, maybe to explain this. Years ago, when I was working in aerospace, the model was you gave the engine away for free and you made all your money on the aftermarket, right? Selling components, selling services. That means you could have built the most expensive engine that cost, a fortune to maintain. GE came into the market and started leasing the engines, right? So it was a power by the hour deal. Well, that meant you had to build your engines to be reliable and cost efficient to maintain. So similarly, if an equipment manufacturer, right, whether it's Apple or somebody else, was leasing their equipment, would they really want it to break after 1 year? Right? They would want to optimize it so that you can get the maximum life out of it and figure out other ways to upsell their business, right? So that's part of it, is that business models have to shift so interests are better aligned. And right now, interests are not fully aligned, right? Because there are people, no different from people wanting you to buy more oil and another group wanting to sell renewable. Well, they're in conflict, right? So that's sort of the challenge that the industry faces. Is how do you, and this is going to happen, I think, as companies have to achieve their net zero goals or go to carbon positive, right? Scope 3 emissions are going to be, that emissions that come from the supply chain are a big piece of it. And you can't just beat your suppliers down to comply with scope 3 emissions is going to be increasingly challenging. So business models have to shift where you can continue to be profitable as a business, but then you are still, sustainable, from an environmental perspective. And
Yeah, I would just add, I think obviously for certain suppliers, there's going to be first movers advantage because there's so many people seeking, I guess you could say ESG compliant suppliers, right? So first movers in that space are going to have more business, probably charge a premium for at least a few years until the others catch up. Which actually brings us, I think you led us into this topic quite well, is how is your equipment able to maybe work in conjunction with various ESG data tracking platforms to help kind of feed in data for ESG, companies that need to report their ESG data or that want to, even if they're not mandated to?
So I think this is a little bit of something that we're still working on with customers because the customers own the data, right? I mean, we anonymize it for the purpose of algorithm development. And today there's data lacking on the carbon impact of an equipment that you buy. It's just not available. So even if a customer says, look, by avoiding replacing this is my carbon impact, that data is just lacking. So I think the first step is, in a lot of cases, the requirement for equipment manufacturing, including ourselves, right? Like we've been calculating what's the environmental impact of manufacturing a smart plug, right? And until that information becomes available, it's immensely difficult to quantify this, right? From a ESG perspective. And I think this is where the bigger enterprises are pushing their suppliers to start quantifying the carbon footprint of manufacturing. And there are some suppliers who are very forward thinking and making this data available. You see that in the consumer world, right? You say sustainably produced products, they have metrics around the carbon footprint to make a t-shirt. Well, that level of visibility is required in the enterprise in order for us to, in order for the customers to be able to actually say, well, this is how we are, working towards maintaining our carbon neutrality. There's still tremendous data gaps.
Yeah, I think that's interesting that that's the space that's moving slower, given that there's actually mandates coming from, obviously soon to be the SEC is kind of going to be bringing that up in the US here. That'll be interesting to see how fast things change once corporations are required, right? I think it'll be interesting. And I think I've been, within this space for about 2 years now, and just the last 2 years, a lot has changed in the sentiment around these items. So I think it's very interesting to see. I guess I'm curious, maybe on a broader spectrum about IoT, where would you say are kind of the biggest areas for application on a broad scale for IoT devices? But let's just start there. Where are the biggest applications that can really be beneficial to helping kind of attack climate change?
I mean, I think I would recommend you think about resource intensive industries, right? Resource intensive sectors where there's lots of waste, right? And inefficiencies, because that's really the promise of the early days of IoT, was the efficiency that could be garnered and new business models that would evolve as a result of it. So whether it was smart cities, right, that was talked about heavily, it was in the manufacturing sector, but and that's a reason, part of it was why we picked a resource intensive industry like biopharma as our initial vertical to focus on, right? Although we apply to so many other industries. And at least from a sustainability perspective, that's a good place to start and understand where there are data gaps and inefficiencies. Something like a semiconductor factory, a lot of the newer ones, they're connected. They're truly a connected factory, right? That you could probably pinpoint where the waste is. That is not most of the industry, right? That is not most of manufacturing. That is not a lot of the municipalities. And so starting there, and then you run into the challenge of where is the value to the business, right? Because in order for something to be adopted, it can't purely be it's good for the planet. I mean, we want to believe that, but the truth is adoption will come a lot quicker if there's also a business benefit. And so that's kind of how I would think about it, is think about places that have the most waste, that are most resource intensive, and start there to see how we optimize the application of the technology. I think IoT technologies have evolved a lot from where they were 10 years ago, but it still fell short of what was possible, and a lot of that had to do with being very complex to deploy, not having the security. So either it was complex to deploy, or if it was easy to deploy, it didn't have the security and scalability that met the requirements of the enterprise, right? So somebody trying to take a consumer product and pushing it into an enterprise customer just didn't work. But I think the new technology platforms allow you to get the best of both worlds. You can have a consumer-like simplicity, but still meet security and scalability requirements or reliability requirements that an enterprise would have.
Mm-hmm. You've mentioned this a few times. I think it's probably worth bringing up, the security side of things. What are the, I guess, cybersecurity risks of IoT devices? What are some of the concerns, and how are those being addressed in general? I'm very, very unfamiliar with cybersecurity, so you might have to do a bit of explaining here, but I'd be keen to understand that.
Well, I think, if you think about a lot of consumer devices, right, that can connect directly to the internet, we call them IP addressable devices, right? Well, if you take that concept and you apply it into the enterprise, it becomes a nightmare from a security perspective. And so you have a lot of these smart devices that eventually have to send their data to the cloud. Well, how are you going to do it securely that you don't get hacked? This is kind of the basic challenge of IoT, right? And who's going to manage the devices? It's one thing if I'm deploying 5 things in your home, but if I'm trying to deploy thousands of IoT sensors within an enterprise, who's actually going to manage the deployment, like not just the deployment, but monitor the health of all these sensors, right? Is it really going to be the IT organization? So that's kind of the piece where, even when you think about security, it's highly fragmented, the market, right? So everyone is trying to do their own hardware stack to connect, and that puts IT organizations in a dilemma, because are they really going to go and qualify 50 different vendors from a security perspective to allow devices to connect? That's why, although there was so many smart devices that manufacturers made, they couldn't get them connected to the network for security reasons, right? And on top of that, some of these collect proprietary data. So that's been the biggest challenge, is that even if you could build a device to connect to the network. It's pretty easy. People do stuff like that with the Raspberry Pi. But how do you ensure that it's secure, that an enterprise IT organization is willing to, accept that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I would assume, do you have any thoughts on how, I guess, integrations will happen in the future between these? Because I know that a lot of industries, I think somebody that comes to mind is when I had Code Labs on, they talked about building software management and how there's many companies doing different things, and they had to kind of eventually get to a point where they started working with many of the partners to create, I don't know if this is a word, integratability with amongst them all. What do you see as the future of that, and how that might play out?
I think that's absolutely critical. So we really look at, our cloud platform has APIs that makes the data very accessible to the customers, right? Because the more contextual data that you can bring around this, the bigger the number of use cases that become accessible to the customer. So it's important that you're not another data silo in the organization. And that requires you to make sure you deliver enough value to the customer that you're comfortable sending your data to the customer to use it for other applications, right? I think that's just table stakes these days. I think very few customers are willing to adopt a new technology that's going to be another data silo that doesn't integrate well with the rest of their systems. And this is more not at the device hardware level, right? That is just, it's still a gap in the marketplace. There isn't an easy platform. I always say, like, we don't want to be building hardware, but we have to, because it's a necessity in order to get to the data. I think the more unified platforms that are capable of handling more sophisticated IoT devices in the enterprise, it'll be better for the marketplace. But at a minimum, the insights that we get on the cloud side have to be easily accessible to the customer so they can enrich the data. Whether it's us or them, that is just table stakes these days, I think.
Mm-hmm. You know, I'm curious. I could be completely just off here, but I'm curious if there was a future of some type of, I don't know if it would be a kind of like we have these different reporting structures within ESG that have come up, right? They're not necessarily government created, but they tend to be a framework typically within a certain industry. Do you see that there might be some type of kind of self-regulating body that comes up to kind of try to unite some of these things, or perhaps, you know, say amongst electronics manufacturers tries to start collecting data from many of these manufacturers, aggregating it, and then using it to do mass improvements across the board? Do you see anything like that forming or being done or anything like that already?
We see customers asking for that. I'll put it that way, right? For them to, a simple example is procurement has been historically a very emotional decision, right? Not necessarily data driven. And to be able to look at different makes and models of equipment, to go beyond the data sheet and say, you know, this freezer is actually pretty reliable, has a great environmental footprint over 10 years, right? Not because they have a phenomenal sales team that can sell it to you. So I think being more data driven in procurement decisions, and as you said, hopefully, you know, companies see it as a competitive advantage to be more transparent with some of this data, so that and somehow get into the cycle to, you know, there are some OEMs that we're working with who are very keen, who are forward thinking, who are keen to understand how their device is performing over time, right? Because there's always the human factor. There's what you test in your laboratories, and then there's the human factor. And to be able to then offer service models that are data driven, right? That are more responsive, as opposed to saying, I'm going to show up on December 1st to maintain your equipment, whether you need it or not. And I don't know if industries will evolve by themselves or it's going to take regulation, right? I think if you want quick change, it's probably a combination of the two. We have seen a lot of momentum within large life science customers who've set very aggressive net zero goals, right? We see a big momentum to achieve that. They're putting more pressure on the supply chain to help reduce their Scope 3 emissions. And I think the hope is, as more people share this information, you know, that's one of the limitations today, right, with the ESG reporting, is that there is no standardized way. There's still a lot of data gaps, and kind of trying to figure out, is it greenwashing? Have you really, you know, had a positive impact? It's still a little bit hazy. And I don't think it's unusual in any early stages of transformation, right? That just happens. And I think we as a community have to work through it and start collecting that data, and eventually the leaders will show how they've done it. You learn from it, and that's what the first mover advantage ends up being, right? So you can either wait to follow the tide that comes, or you can ride the wave.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating. Honestly, the ESG space and just transparency in general is something that really does fascinate me, because I think when you are super honest about everything, right, and you just follow the truth, essentially, you end up with the best business models, first of all, but also you end up helping kind of bring into the light inequities and things that are done throughout the supply chain and throughout other areas of business. I really do want to talk about regulation. You mentioned it already a little bit. Are there things being done or regulations coming down the pipeline within the US or other countries that relate to IoT collection of data? You know, are there maybe specific cities or examples? I know it tends to be that New York and California lead in some of these items, but I'm just curious to see what the landscape is, what's being required, and what you think the future will be for that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's specifically IoT as much as it's the requirements to have data, right? It's still, I think there's still a lot of wiggle room for a lot of companies on the reporting requirements. We definitely know that I think in Europe and stuff, they're probably a little bit further ahead in terms of, and I think they've been doing this for a while, right? Utility pricing, depending on, exceeding a certain consumption target. As long as electricity prices are incredibly cheap and oil is cheap, and overconsumption is part of a lot of business models, that's going to just be a challenge, right? So there's obviously ambitious goals, but I don't think the consequences are meaningful enough for people to change their business models significantly. I think a lot of companies are still hoping that we replace our smartphones next year, right? And so it doesn't matter. And probably 90% of people don't need to replace a smartphone every 12 months.
Yeah, just because the M1 is really, really great and I really want a new Mac doesn't mean I need it. I'll survive.
I think it's just it's kind of putting in, like, it goes from the consumer to the enterprise, right? I think just as humans, we're just used to living. I'm no different, right? Like I buy electrical stuff, or we're just used to thinking that we have unlimited resources. And until products come with labels showing the impact of choices we're making, then it's going to be just hard to do it purely with regulation. I do think as humans, we'll make better choices if we understand the implications of our choices. I think in the food industry, they started putting calories. So at least people are making a conscious decision on what they're eating, right? Maybe we could have a tag that says, well, this was the environmental impact of you buying this pair of shoes or buying this new, computer. And I mean, I forget the statistic. I think I've said this before. I think something like 70% of the world's resources are used by 25% of the world's population.
That's right? Crazy.
So, and I didn't grow up in, we grew up in, in Africa, and we grew up in some of the, what would be considered developing countries, and we got along great with a lot less. But that's what I mean. Like, I think there has to be social responsibility that comes on every company, right? It does start with that. And then regulations obviously are needed to enforce that, but business models will have to change, and it'll be uncomfortable because so many business models have been built on selling more stuff.
Yeah, I think that's something, I don't know if this is going to be coming out before or after the other podcast, but we just had another show that we talked to a little bit about restraining, right? Like how much is enough, right? How much profit does a company really need to make? Should it be solely for profit? Should shareholders take kind of step back a little bit? And that to me will be an interesting shift to see if it does happen. I think Americans probably have the furthest to come in terms of that mentality of more right now. But we'll see. I do want to move into maybe a little bit about the education space. Actually, one last comment I was keen, maybe you have comments on, or if not, just kind of interested to hear, is within regulation, I know a lot of people talk about like promoting different bills and things to accomplish whatever, right? But I think that I would be keen to see the future of how, whether it's IoT or data in some way, is actually able to help inform those decisions better and see what the second and third order effects of regulation are in the longer terms to help maybe adjust the regulation and come back to it. I don't know if you have any comments on that or not.
No, that's very true, because people always find a way to game regulations, right? We've seen that time and time again. And, I think I used to jokingly say in my GE days, people sometimes pick the metrics that will make them look successful, as opposed to using it to drive the right decisions, right? So I think that's a great idea to actually quantify. I don't know what that would mean for a lot of politicians, but to actually quantify the impact of regulations that are passed. I think that's a brilliant idea.
Yeah, I think it'd be something interesting that could solve a lot of problems and make things
Yeah.
come to light. But let's go on to kind of towards the end here. I want to talk about the education side of things. So um there's a couple of questions I have in this area. Let's first talk about talent and what kind of, I guess, educational background it kind of requires to get into the IoT space for anybody listening who's interested. Could you kind of talk about what your recommendations would be in terms of maybe somebody who's really close to finishing high school and going into university, and what should they be doing to if they want to build a career in the space?
You know, there are lots of different roles you can have in IoT, right? Everything from something that's more hardware, electrical oriented to, wireless design to the actual software application layer. So, there's lots of different areas that you can get into. Somebody coming out of high school, my best advice is always get your fundamentals right. If you're going to go into engineering, get a solid foundation. It'll be a journey to figure out what you resonate well with, like, are you more of a startup person? Are you more of a big company person, right? And it's a little bit of a journey, but I think you want to get your solid foundation. And there are so many different roles within IoT. Think of yourself as a problem solver. If you're a problem solver, IoT is a great space for you. And you can either come in on the hardware, the software side, the application engineering side, right? So lots of different areas. And I think most engineering degrees will let you come in from a technical perspective, will let you enter that. And then I think there are lots of new roles opening up in sustainability in general, right? Helping companies measure their sustainability impact even. And that's not a space that, I know deeply about in terms of educational background, but I think it doesn't just have to be purely on the technical side.
Mm-hmm. Do you feel that, and maybe you do some work with universities, obviously doing some work with research labs, I'm assuming there's a decent amount of interface there. Do you think that universities are doing a good job of helping feed people into the space in general? And do you think, maybe this is a separate question or it can be in tandem, do you think that maybe there's overeducation in terms of taking so much time to get people into a space that's growing quickly and perhaps needs more talent quicker? What are your thoughts on that?
Now you're going to get me on a soapbox in the education system here.
That's okay. It's one of my favorite topics.
So I think, when it comes to education, a good balance of theory and practice is always good. And it really depends on what your career path is going to be. Are you going to be somebody who's actually designing something that requires very deep expertise, right? Are you going to be somebody who wants to be more broad, more of a system person? So I've always been more of a system person. I just love to be able to connect lots of dots. So you need to understand your fundamentals, but you might not become a specialist. And I mean, I've been out of university for a while, so I can't really comment on how the education system has evolved, higher education has evolved. But I just think entering university, a lot of kids are missing fundamentals that are really needed for them to be successful in university. But I think once they're there, just technology moves fast. Universities just give you the tools to learn. Most of us have learned entirely new industries that had nothing to do with what we went to school for. But I say working from first principles, right? It's your foundation that helps you continue to learn and build on. But I don't think a university degree these days is a guarantee for employment anymore.
Yeah, I think that's the case. I think obviously this is something I'm very passionate about because I did not go to university and was homeschooled actually. Yeah. So I think it's and I'm surrounded I'm in a community with many other people who are similar situation. I almost think, do you have maybe tips? Because perhaps one of my observations is that the reason why people oftentimes get into university and then go to something completely different than they go to school for is because they just don't know about themselves and what they want, and they only learn that through doing. So do you have maybe advice for people who are still, set on going straight to school after finishing high school, straight into university, without, practicing and testing a few things to kind of understand what their motives are? How can somebody early in their career help to figure out what they want for a direction?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the challenges people face is when you leave too much of a transition between high school and university, is having to get back into things that would have just mentally been a transition, right? Whether it's going to have to refreshing your calculus when you have to go back after 3 years. And that can be very discouraging because I think in North America, the gap in terms of the standard between high schools and universities is pretty significant. You know, I would see people really struggle through that first year transition in engineering. And we studied under a different education system where that transition to first year was really nothing, right? So to be honest, I'm not a big fan of these big gaps because I think unless the person has the capability to dive right back into studying, it can be first year can end up being very discouraging. But I think there are lots of things kids can do while they're in high school to figure out. And I think there's so much opportunity here, right? That we didn't get when we were growing up in terms of exploring careers. You know, do you gravitate more towards the sciences or arts? And I think the schools themselves can offer more of that, right? Job shadow somebody, right? Even as a high schooler, go spend 3 weeks of your summer, right? You know, job shadowing somebody, because the real world is always different from the glamorous pictures that you see, right? Even if you work in a big tech company, sometimes you're put in a box in terms of what you're able to do. Working in a startup is exciting because you get to work in lots of different things, but it's a whole different level of pressure, right? Because you don't have 500 people to replace you if you don't show up tomorrow. So I think exposing children to what the different career paths could be through job shadowing, internship, so on, when they're young, I think it's really important because I do believe you know, the children's belief in themselves is really set at a young age, right? The longer you go where you're not able to do, whether it's your math or your English, the less confidence that you have that you can do this as you get to high school. And they start eliminating a whole bunch of opportunities because they think they'll never be good at it because they might have had a negative experience in 5th grade. So I'm a very big proponent of exposing children to all the different things they could do when they're young so that they can, you know, pick a major that they feel resonates with them.
Yeah, I always find that interesting is because the curiosity drive tends to be a bit higher at a younger age. And then if they can be exposed to things that they've never been aware of, that allows them to kind of pull at that thread and unwind it, right? I always find it so fascinating that I honestly wish that I could impart all the things I learned in just a couple of years of recruitment to people, you know, in early high school, because you learn about so many career opportunities that you never even heard of, right? And I think that it's very difficult because, you know, you hear, you know, lawyer, doctor, policeman, or whatnot, like the basic things, right? And it's sometimes, depending on your upbringing, it's sometimes tough to understand what options are out there. But no, I think that's interesting. Interesting point to leave it on. I think, are there any final thoughts you'd like to offer to the audience? Again, anything regarding this topic, anything that you think we've missed that you really want to talk about?
I mean, I just think everyone talks about not being able to kick the can down the road. And I think we just have to shift our mindset where you don't have to go from overconsumption to scarcity mode. I don't think it's one extreme or the other, right? So I think being a little bit practical about how we approach this, educating people, using data to educate people, I think is going to be important to separate fact from fiction. And I think it's very achievable. I don't think there are lots of things that we've shown customers. You can have meaningful sustainability impacts and have great operational efficiency as a result of it. And this is not a 5-year goal or a 10-year goal. It's very achievable. And I think this is where I think the media and as a community, we can help educate people that there are lots of things that we can do today that's not doom or gloom, you know, options.
Yeah, I think it's always interesting that people oftentimes, at least maybe people who are not too familiar with the space, associate going green as also breaking the bank, right? And like destroying the economy. When obviously in reality, it's more of a kind of an abundance mindset of let's use things responsibly. Let's be good stewards of the things that we have, right? So anyways, very interesting conversation today. Thank you so much for coming on. Really excited to see what you guys continue to do, and I'm assuming as you continue to enter into more markets, it'd be really exciting for the space.
Absolutely. We're looking forward to, some stellar years ahead, and really enjoyed chatting with you. So thank you for this opportunity.
Yes, thank you so much.
All right, we really hope you enjoyed today's conversation with Priya. If you would like to hear more of these discussions, more of these conversations, please do hit subscribe and turn on notifications to be made aware in the future. And if you are listening on Apple Podcasts, we appreciate a rating and a review. It does help us to gain greater reach. Same thing with Spotify. If you are interested in helping us spread the word, please do share this with somebody who might find it fascinating, perhaps somebody who could directly benefit from this technology or implementing this technology through cost savings, or just through making a good environmental impact rather than a negative one. And of course, please do follow us on LinkedIn at the Clean Techies Pod page there. We are going away from the monthly newsletter format and going to more kind of small bites weekly on the LinkedIn page. And then of course, please do connect with Priya on LinkedIn to learn more. And you can go to the WattIQ website at wattiq.io to learn more about what they're doing. And of course, as always, feel free to reach me on Twitter with any questions you have or comments or potential guests for the podcast. And then just a quick note, our next episode after a quick break, we are going to have kind of a mini series on ESG. So we will first be starting with Ryan Kemp, who is an expert in ESG, and he's the founder of Pueo Consulting. He does really bring a quite interesting perspective to the ESG space because of his personal experiences with a lot of travel to post-colonial developing countries. And I think it's a really great way that we went over kind of overall ESG with Ryan in the next episode. We did get pretty philosophical at times, so it's quite interesting if that's something of that kind of fascinates you. So please do join us next time on the pod to hear Ryan and his thoughts on ESG. But again, thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you next time on Clean Techies, the podcast.